Thank you, Greg. My name is Ajay Yalwar. Along with me are my colleagues Pradnya, Bharambe, and Jennifer McGrogan. Today, we are going to talk about preparing legacy data for submission from PMDA and FDA standards point of view. So this is a brief agenda of our talk, overview of legacy data conversion, and then some guidelines around the legacy data conversion. And we will look at a case study with some examples, and we briefly compare two regulatories, basically PMDA and FDA, which are considered in this case study. And we will see how we can optimize the process when the legacy data is converted for submission to two regulatories, basically PMDA and FDA. And then we'll conclude with some of the key learnings. So legacy data, as per Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, is data in a non-standardized format, not supported by regulatory agencies, and never lists data standards catalog. So the data standards catalog provides a framework for organizing the study data, including the templates for data sets and standard names for variables, such that the regulatory agencies will be able to receive the data, process, and review and archives more effectively and efficiently. So both FDA and PMDA have the data catalogs, standards catalog of their own. Current FDA data standards catalog is version 6.6, dated 29th of July 2020. Basically, the data standards catalog for FDA provides all the guidelines and standards for submissions done to various agencies of the FDA, including post-marketing studies, product labeling, and clinical and non-clinical studies. Similarly, PMDA as well has the data standards catalog of its own, which is dated 1st of November 2019. The PMDA data standards catalog also provides the standards for clinical study data sets, data definition files, and other study documents. So data standardization is a part of electronic submission. Both the PMDA and FDA has made electronic submission mandatory. So with the electronic submission, regulatories will be able to store the data in a systematic manner and also register each study. And with the stored data, the regulatory agencies and the reviewers within regulatory agencies will be able to access and perform the review by drilling down into the data and performing the subgroup analysis if required, and they can effectively have the discussions, scientific discussions, to take more effective decisions. Also, with the accumulation of data across the products, regulatory agencies will be able to perform more high-level scientific researches, as well as they will be able to develop therapeutic area guidelines as well for publication. So that is the advantage of electronic submission in the standardized format. So, like I mentioned, both the regulatories have defined the timelines for electronic submission, where it is made mandatory for all the studies to be submitted in an electronic format. So, FDA published conformance guidance on 17th December 2014 with a 2 years of transition period. So that means any study submitted post 24 months of publication of data binding guidance document has to be mandatorily be submitted in electronic format. And for FDA, the reference point for the cutoff is start of the study, which is the first subject signing the informed consent. Similarly, PM has started accepting the electronic submission from 1st of August 2016 with 3.5 years of transition period, which means post 31st March this year, all the studies that are being submitted to PMDA has to be in electronic format mandatorily. The difference between PMDA and FDA electronic submission is that the reference point for PMDA is the date of submission, unlike FDA, where the reference point is the first subject signing the informed consent. So Though both the regulatories does not provide any standard approach for converting the legacy data to standard format. However, there are some key challenges that we need to address and we need to keep in mind while converting the study data to the standard format. The challenges are the limited ability to determine the location of collected CRF data in the converted STTM unless we annotate the legacy CRFs with STTM variables. So that means all the studies, when they are converted to standard format, the CRF pages has to be annotated and submitted to the regulatories for the STTM variables. Similarly, the limited traceable path from STTM to the legacy analysis data should be also addressed, or while converting the data, we need to keep that in mind and build the traceability from the analysis data to the STTM data sets. Also, the limited ability to replicate or confirm the legacy analysis data sets, that is analysis variables or imputed variables using the STTMs also should be traceable in the analysis data sets or ADAM data sets that we prepare in the standard format. Also, the limited ability to confirm the derivation of intermediate analysis data sets or custom domains has to be traceable. For the complex analysis that we perform, sometimes we have to create the intermediate analysis data sets, which will then be fed into the summary analysis data set, which will be used for actual TLF programming, TLF generation. So all the data sets has to have the traceability from the source point. If the studies are planned for the pooled analysis at the later stage, all the studies that are going to be pooled has to be consistent in following all the standard approaches. So that has to be kept in mind while building the standard data sets from the legacy data sets. And also, all the TLFs that we produce should be reconciled with legacy studies CSRs. And that means the TLFs should be annotated with the ADAM dataset variables, and that will actually form the robust traceable path from the CSR result or tables to the source data. So this is the process flow of the case study that we have considered here. Basically, it was a large project of 50 plus legacy studies data conversion to current industry standards for submission to PMDA predominantly, and some of these studies were also submitted to FDA, and that is where the actual challenge was. So in the block above shows the legacy data flow, how the analysis data sets were made during the legacy study conduct. And we can see that the source CRFs were producing the source data, and those source data were used for analysis data set creation, and then the TLFs which fed into the CSR. For some of these studies, we had tabulated data in the previous STTM format, and also some of the studies had defines as well. So from that, while converting the data to the current standards, we used the source CRFs. We annotated them for the STTMs, and then based on the STTM annotated CRFs, we built the STTM mapping specification and then the STTM data sets. And these STTM data sets were used for developing the ADAM specifications and ADAM data sets, using which we reconciled the CSR results which were produced in the legacy studies. While creating the STTM mapping specifications, we also refer to the source data and tabulated data wherever it was available. Similarly, while building the ADAM specifications, we also refer to the analysis data sets and also sometimes define files as well in order to understand exactly what was done in the legacy studies. And this process sometimes became cyclic because while until we reconcile all the CSR results, we may not be able to make sure the data is completely standardized or replicate the exactly the analysis that was performed in the legacy study. So we had to update the STTM mappings as well as the ADAM specification and ADAM data sets in the course of this process. Based on the STTM datasets that were developed, we created the define.xml and the CSDRG. Similarly, for ADAMS, we created the define.xml and the CADRG. So these are some of the examples which show how we standardize the legacy data. The first example is for an adverse event data sets like we saw in the previous presentation. The coding of the adverse events has to be done based on the latest Meta dictionary data set. So we recorded the previous legacy dictionary data set as well as the current dictionary data set that the adverse events were recorded into the trial summary domain, and that was used to record the legacy coded terms into the supplementary domains, and then those were brought into the analysis ADAE data set by including both the current coded terms as well as the legacy coded terms. In this way, we were able to trace back what was there in the legacy data and what is in the current data. This example is for the vital signs reporting. Since PMDA expects that all the vital signs to be reported in the SI units, so the legacy in the legacy data we had the vital signs parameters reported in the conventional units. For example, the systolic BP and diastolic BP, the units used were mmHg, whereas the SI unit for those parameters is kilopascal. So we created two analysis data set, basically one for reconciling the legacy results, for which we created a data set called ADVS-RU for reporting unit, where we recorded the results of the analysis results, the collected results in the conventional unit, and then we created one more analysis data set as ADVS, where the values were recorded in the standard units. So we used ADVS-RU for reconciling the CSR tables and listings to ensure that the converted data produced the same result as they were in the legacy data. So this is another example where we can see that some of the data fields are not part of the source data, but are required for the analysis. So here you can see the SAP extract where it says the potency adjustment needs to be done based on the batch strength formulation, which is specified in the batch release certificate of the investigational drug. Since this information will not be available in the source data, we had to include that for the analysis purpose in the ADAM data sets. Since it was not part of the source data, we had to clearly define that in the define.xml file as shown in the below block. So with that implementation, we were able to reconcile all the CSR results, and until we match the results exactly, we were trying to understand what was done in the legacy data, and that is again a challenge, especially if the studies are very old and we do not have clear information on what was done. We sometimes have to go back to the sponsors to get all the information required. And these are some of the key challenges and examples shown. So for the next slides, I will hand over to Pradnya. Pradnya, over to you.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, nice. Thank you. Thanks, Ajay. So, moving on the next slide. As explained in the earlier slide, for both PMDA and FDA, their currently accepted versions are given in their respective data standard catalog. So, there are some differences between both of these regulatory agencies, which are listed below. So, for currently, PMDA and FDA officially accept SDTM version 3.2. Older versions are also accepted based on study initiation date. For ADAMS, PMDA officially accept ADAM IG version 1.0, while FDA accept 1.1. In some cases, PMDA accept ADAM IG version 1.1. That we can see in next section. Pinnacle 21 validation engines are also different for both the agencies. Reviewer guide naming convention is different for PMDA as well as FDA as shown here. Analysis result metadata submission is mandatory for PMDA submission, while FDA it is not mandatory to submit ARM currently. Here is example of case study. Like this example is based on our current submission experience when sponsor decided to submit data for same compound to PMDA and FDA simultaneously. Creating two different packages was time consuming as well as it needed more resources. So considering the common requirement from both the agencies, we created only one set of e-data which can be submitted to both the authorities. So for FDA submission, we validated the data using FDA engine, referencing the ADAM IG version 1.1, and uncorrectable errors for explanation we added into reviewer's guide. Warning explanation is also needed to enter in reviewer's guide for FDA submission, while in PMDA submission, the same data we validated referencing ADAM IG 1.0 using PMDA engine, and warning explanation is not needed for PMDA submission into reviewer's guide. Only uncorrectable errors explanation was added into reviewer's guide. Traceability checks play important role in PMDA submission because agency perform independent validation on their side, and incorrect result may delay the submission process. PMDA specifically mentioned to add SDTM, AE, DM, and EX domain while validating ADAM dataset to confirm the traceability with SDTM. So here is example of AD-AE validation. All adverse event in SDTM AE must be present in AD-AE dataset. There are some exceptions like screen failure subjects which can be excluded if they are not needed in analysis, and that explanation we need to add into reviewer's guide. There are some differences file checking CD's compliance with Pinnacle 21. PMDA categorized the severity of issues into reject, errors, and warnings, while FDA categorized it into errors and warnings. So we should be very careful with the pattern of reject and error because there are some errors which can be the reject criteria for PMDA. So it is always good to validate the both with the both engine at the same time. So reject criteria must be eliminated. There is no exceptions. Errors, if there are any uncorrectable errors, then that explanation need to add in reviewer's guide. For warnings, PMDA, even the rule is violated, explanation is not needed for warnings. But for FDA submission, we need to include the explanation for warning as well in reviewer's guide. So once all errors are corrected, we can submit the same data to both the agencies. For next slide, I'm passing it to Jennifer.
After locating and correcting any of the reject and error messages, the remaining messages do have to be explained in the reviewer's guide. So since the reviewer's guide was created from a global validation report, meaning the validation considered both PMDA and FDA rules, it displays differently than if you created one with only PMDA or only FDA. So to provide assurance that even among these differing reports, that all of the issues were in fact addressed, our submissions actually included multiple versions of validation reports. So in addition to the global report that we incorporated in our reviewer's guide, we also included PMDA only and FDA only validation reports. Due to the difference in standards, there were some PMDA issues that remained in the reports delivered. However, as Pradnya just explained, no rejects were allowed to remain. So I'll touch on that a little bit more on the next slide. There are two recommendations for dealing with the difference in reports. The first one is the way that I just explained. You can make one single submission where the ADRG contains all of the combined messaging from the FDA and the PMDA, and you provide those explanations in the reviewer's guide. Alternatively, you could use that same e-data and that same define to create the different reviewers' guides, and at that point you would have two submissions. Both of these should work. We elected to use the first one. So next slide. Okay. So the validation issues we encountered, here is an example. You can see on the left side, we have a Pinnacle 21 Enterprise Global Validation. Underneath that, we have a Pinnacle 21 Community Validation that was run using the FDA standards. And underneath that, we have Pinnacle 21 Community with a PMDA validation. You will note that the PMDA report actually issues errors for variable names that are appropriate for the FDA submission and are therefore not getting flagged. So this is an example of the errors from the PMDA submission that were left in as we created this combined submission. So this is just something to be aware of, and you should be validating your data and define your entire package on multiple validation engines if you will be submitting it to, if you're trying to appease both FDA and PMDA. Next slide. There were also some unexpected differences in the validation reports. So that's something to be wary of while you're creating these submissions. Note that although Pinnacle 21 Enterprise does have a global validation, which should validate the package using both standards, there actually are some circumstances where the messaging can be missed. So in this example, the PMDA validation report was the only one of three that generated issues for the user-defined code list. You can see for this DAPER1, none of the other validation reports that we ran actually output that error. So you're going to want to be wary of this, that you can get those differences for things that you would want to correct. You would definitely want to correct this user-defined code list thing. And in order to avoid finding that in the final hour of the submission and be able to address it with time to do so, you'll want to run it on these different validation engines as you're creating the data, anytime changes are made, that kind of thing. So that's just noting the difference in messaging that you can see. We'll now get into our lessons learned. We definitely recommend that a standard subject matter expert is provided for situations where submitting packages to multiple regulatory agencies. This can allow you to ask questions and fully understand the process, and it'll just ensure accuracy with the package that you're submitting. Traceability is really key and should be visible from SPTM datasets to ADAM datasets all the way through to the reconciliation results. So that's something to keep in mind too as you're creating this. You'll want to have a really constant rapport between your SPTM mapping and ADAM programmers. You want everybody on the same page and communicating really well. And something that we found helped us in terms of keeping this relationship very communicative was a single status tracker that we developed to track SPTM and ADAM issues and the resolution status for all of our different studies. This really helped in tracking and recording the decisions that we made and applying it to the multiple places that we would maybe need to all throughout the project. This tracker was also accessible by clients, which I would also recommend because it assisted a lot in applying any of their updates once we received feedback, and it helped with the back and forth between them as well. That was really useful in terms of communication all over the team. Ideally, you really want to be achieving consistency across all of the studies so that that can aid in future analysis like ISS and ISC. It's also super helpful to develop macros and help check the consistency across studies. We have a few different ones for defines and things like that. So you want to be really getting that consistency across all of your packages. And finally, you'll want to run those Pinnacle 21 validation reports and address the issues every time SPTM or ATOM undergoes changes. You'll want to run those different validations, as I talked about earlier, to make sure that you're really addressing all of the messaging. In addition, it's helpful to use a changes made tab in your specifications so that your entire team can ensure that they've incorporated all of the updates since whenever the specs were approved. So those are all the lessons we learned in creating this presentation. And here we have our references. And I can open it up to any questions. And also thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. Do we have any? We have not received any questions so far, I believe.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay, Greg, as people are typing questions and it gets into the software. So we just hang on for a minute.
Okay.
So Jennifer, how would you rate the tools that are available for submissions, the working group deliverables that Fuse provides?
I'm sorry.
Regarding submissions, like the Study Data Reviewer's Guide and other documents that have been created recently.
Pradnya, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Like the ADRG or the SDRG.
The tool?
Yeah, have those been helpful to you?
I would say so in terms of, we have to look at a lot of documentation while we're trying to prepare these and determine, because we would get some messaging. I was very documentation focused as I was working on this. And so we would get some messaging that were errors, and we would have to determine if it was an actual error or a false error, something that could be explained away. So it was a lot of weeding through the differences between the documents for PMDA and FDA and trying to determine what would actually be okay to submit versus what was a real error. So I would say those were helpful with that and determining that. But also my team was very helpful in terms of doing that communication, talking to them and getting their opinions on how I was reading those tools and understanding them as well. So both of those things. I still feel fairly new to this, and I feel like I'm learning a lot from everybody all the time. So sorry, I'm a little sheepish with my answers.
That's fine. Thank you.
Well, that's exactly what the few SDEs are for, right? To disseminate information. So as Chris predicted, we do have a bunch of questions popping in. So let's start with the first one. The first one is, running current version of the Pinnacle 21 validator on legacy data sets ends up having reject issues for legacy data. How will that be handled?
Could you repeat the first part again? I'm so sorry.
So it says, the question was, running current versions of the Pinnacle 21 validator on legacy data sets ends up having reject issues for the legacy data. How will it be handled?
We actually had to up-version the legacy data in order to correct those errors and get rid of them. We explained the way that we could that didn't need to be removed from our reviewer's guide, but any rejects we did have to address in terms of up-versioning the data and addressing those issues. So we updated them.
Okay. Next question that came in is, strange that a code list issue was not caught by Pinnacle 21 Enterprise. Did you let Pinnacle 21 know about the discrepancy?
I did. I didn't really receive any kind of resolution because I found it and I fixed the error, so it wasn't. I don't know if it was terribly problematic when I let them know, but I also found that very strange, and that was why I wanted to share that, because if you don't run it on that engine until 10 minutes before you're supposed to post it to the client, then you have to redo everything. So I highly recommend running it in all of those different areas. I can't necessarily figure out what triggers certain ones, but yeah, those codeless ones, that was very strange to see. So I would just say validate using the different engines as much as possible to catch those.
Okay. Trying to get many of these questions done before we run out of time. Did you recreate all the TLFs using new atoms and compare them with the legacy TLFs? Did you create CSR addendum or short to document the possible discrepancies in the TLFs using the new atom?
Yeah, we did not actually recreate all the TLFs, but we validated them as a QC kind of. We checked all the numbers in the TLFs, but we did not reproduce as such all the TLFs using the latest atoms.
Okay. How many types of errors emerged during the Pinnacle 21 report?
Can you repeat the question?
How many types?
Yeah, the question says, how many types of errors emerged during Pinnacle 21 report?
A fair amount of different kinds of errors. I would say because we were creating multiple similar packages, they were similar errors in which we knew how to deal with them quicker as we did more and more of them. But it was unpredictable based on whatever the data was that we put in, how we would then have to deal with those. But an average amount, I would say, nothing unstandard from other submissions that I've seen.
Okay. Let's do one more, and then what we'll do is we'll probably have to break it for the networking, right, Chris?
Correct.
Because we do have a series. We'll forward these to the 3D inbox. So let's pick this one. It says, will the intermediate data sets be included in a submission package?
Yes. Yeah, intermediate data sets in terms of analysis data sets. Yeah, go on, Pradnya.
Yeah, actually in our studies there was no intermediate data set created, but if it is created, then we need to include it in submission.
Okay. Okay. Trying to keep to the schedule today. There are some additional questions, and what we'll do is we'll move them into the inbox and get them to the presenters for eventual answering and getting results back to everybody, okay?